The sun had just started to sink behind the horizon when the FBI director decided to leave the private meeting he had attended in a quiet city not far from Washington. He was dressed in plain clothes, without the heavy presence of bodyguards around him. Sometimes he preferred traveling this way: no flashing sirens, no motorcade, just a chance to move like an ordinary person for a short while. After all, blending into the normal rhythm of life was something he enjoyed when his schedule allowed. That evening, the director chose to drive himself in an unmarked vehicle. It was a practical decision. The road was familiar, the weather was calm, and he thought a simple drive would give him a chance to clear his mind before returning to the capital. The meeting had been long, focused on security reforms, and his head was heavy with details of strategies, reports, and policies. Driving through smaller towns was his way of breathing fresh air, away from the noise of politics and pressure. As he drove down the main road of a quiet town, the streets were mostly empty. Families were inside their homes, lights glowing behind curtains, and a few children were still playing on porches before bedtime. The director was relaxed, his hand resting on the steering wheel, the radio playing softly. Nothing about that moment suggested trouble. But then, from his rear-view mirror, he noticed a local patrol car following him. At first, he thought little of it. Cars were often behind him on small town roads. Yet the way the headlights stayed close, the way the vehicle moved, suggested the officer wasn't just casually driving. Moments later, the siren lights flashed red and blue, and the sound of a horn signaled him to pull over. The director slowed his car and parked it carefully on the side of the road. He didn't panic. Being stopped by police was not unusual, even for someone of his rank, especially when he wasn't using his official car. Still, he found it a little odd. He hadn't been speeding, he hadn't ignored any signals, and his vehicle was registered perfectly. There was no reason to stop him. The officer stepped out of the patrol car with an unusual kind of sharpness. He walked quickly, his face stern, and his movements stiff. He looked at the director as if already judging him before a single word was spoken. The director rolled his window down, his expression calm and professional. "Good evening, officer," he said in a steady voice. The officer didn't reply with the same politeness. Instead, his tone was sharp. "License and registration." "Now." The director nodded, moving slowly. He had been in countless tense situations during his career, both at home and abroad. He knew the value of measured movements. His hand rested on the dashboard before he reached for his wallet. The officer's eyes followed him closely, as though expecting trouble. "Of course," the director said softly, handing over the license. His voice carried no irritation, only calmness. But inside, he was curious. Why had this officer stopped him? There had been no traffic violation, no broken light, nothing that could justify the pullover. The officer studied the license for a long moment, his eyes squinting as though he couldn't believe the name written on it. He looked back at the director with suspicion. "Where are you headed?" he asked, his tone less like a question and more like an interrogation. "Back to Washington," the director replied evenly. The officer didn't hide his mistrust. He leaned closer to the window, his hand brushing near his holster in a way that wasn't necessary. The director noticed this instantly but remained calm. Years of training had taught him to stay composed, no matter the provocation. "I'll need you to step out of the vehicle," the officer said suddenly. His tone carried authority, but also something else, an edge of hostility that had nothing to do with traffic duty. The director studied him quietly for a moment, his expression unreadable. He had met thousands of officers across the country in his career, most of them professional, respectful, and dedicated to their duty. But every once in a while, there were encounters that reminded him why oversight and accountability were so critical. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out of the car slowly. The cool evening air brushed against his face, but the street was quiet. Only the sound of the patrol car's engine and the distant hum of insects filled the silence. The officer's hand now rested firmly near his weapon. He looked at the director with narrowed eyes. "What's in the car?" "Nothing unusual," the director replied calmly. "You are welcome to check if you'd like." The officer hesitated. His suspicion didn't seem based on reason, but on something deeper. He spoke in a voice laced with doubt. "You think you can just drive through here without being noticed?" The director didn't respond right away. He measured his words, knowing that reacting with frustration would only worsen the tension. He looked at the officer directly, his eyes steady. "I am simply traveling home. Nothing more." For a moment, there was silence. The two men stood in the glow of the patrol lights, one calm, the other visibly tense. The officer's body language spoke volumes: restless movements, heavy breathing, and a grip near his holster that suggested his mind was already imagining threats that did not exist. The director, however, remained collected. His voice stayed firm but respectful, his movements deliberate and controlled. He had been in far more dangerous situations than this, yet he knew the importance of patience. The encounter stretched into a delicate balance of restraint. The officer's eyes darted back and forth, uncertain, while the director simply stood by his car, waiting, offering no challenge but also showing no fear. The quiet street seemed to hold its breath. A passing neighbor peeked through a window curtain, sensing something unusual. A teenager on a bicycle slowed down across the road, his eyes wide, before quickly pedaling away. The director noticed these small details, but his focus stayed on the officer. He thought carefully about his next steps. He carried his badge inside his jacket pocket, but he also knew that revealing it too quickly might be misinterpreted as reaching for something else. Timing was everything. He decided to let the situation play out a little longer, to gauge whether the officer was willing to handle the stop in a professional manner or whether this would escalate further. The atmosphere grew heavier. The director's calmness contrasted sharply with the officer's agitation, creating a silent tension that felt like the air before a storm. Though the moment was uncomfortable, the director knew he had to remain steady. He had spent his career training agents to handle situations exactly like this with patience, professionalism, and control. Now, he was living the very lesson he often gave: sometimes the most powerful weapon is composure. The evening continued in silence, broken only by the crackle of the officer's radio and the distant chirp of crickets. The director stood still, his posture straight, his face calm. The officer, however, shifted his weight uneasily, still not convinced of the man standing before him. In those quiet seconds, the director understood more than ever why true leadership required humility and restraint. He was a man with authority, yes, but in that moment, stripped of titles and uniforms, he was simply a traveler facing a challenge on a lonely road. And how he handled it would decide everything that followed. The officer's eyes never left the director as the seconds ticked by. The night air felt colder now, though the temperature hadn't really dropped. It was the weight of the moment, the tension between the two men, that made every sound louder and every movement sharper. A dog barked in the distance, then silence returned, leaving only the hum of the patrol car's engine and the faint buzz of streetlights. The director stood calmly beside his car, hands visible at his sides, his posture steady. He had dealt with trained negotiators, foreign agents, and dangerous situations in faraway lands, but rarely had he experienced this kind of treatment on a quiet American street. He didn't feel fear, but he felt the seriousness of the moment. This was no ordinary stop. The officer suddenly stepped closer, his voice cutting the silence like a blade. "Don't move." His hand pressed firmly against his holster, and with a quick motion, he pulled out his weapon and pointed it at the director. The director's expression didn't change. His breathing stayed even. He looked directly into the officer's eyes, his voice calm and level when he finally spoke. "There's no need for that." But the officer didn't lower the weapon. His hands trembled slightly, a sign of nerves, yet his eyes burned with a determination that was misplaced. He believed he had control of the situation, even though control was slipping away from him with every second he held his stance. The director lifted his hands slightly, showing he had nothing in them, moving slowly and deliberately. He knew every movement was being judged. Any sudden gesture could be misunderstood, and he refused to give the officer a reason to act recklessly. "I'm cooperating," the director said softly. "There's no danger here." The officer's tone grew harsher. "Stop talking. Just stand there." The director remained silent for a moment, his mind working carefully. He knew the balance of power could shift at any time. This wasn't about strength, it was about patience and control. The weapon pointed at him was a threat, but he refused to let fear enter the picture. He had been trained to see beyond the immediate danger, to find a way to guide the situation back to reason. The street around them stayed eerily quiet. A car turned onto the road far in the distance, but when the driver noticed the flashing lights, they quickly took another route. No one wanted to be near the standoff. Yet in the houses nearby, curtains twitched. People were watching, whispering, unsure of what they were seeing. The officer's breathing grew heavier. He repeated his demand. "What's in the car?" "Documents from work," the director replied calmly. His voice carried no panic, only truth. "Nothing illegal, nothing hidden." The officer seemed unsatisfied. His grip on the weapon tightened. His jaw clenched as if he was fighting an inner battle between reason and stubbornness. He looked at the license again, then back at the man before him. The name should have carried weight, but instead of respect, the officer's eyes filled with doubt. "You think I don't know when someone's lying to me?" he said sharply. The director met his stare without flinching. "I have no reason to lie to you. I've told you exactly who I am and where I'm going." The officer shook his head. "Doesn't matter. People like you think you can get away with anything." His tone was filled with assumption, not fact. The director knew he had to be careful. If he revealed his badge too quickly, the officer might see it as a sudden move. But if he waited too long, the situation could spiral further. He kept his voice measured, his body language calm. "Officer," he said slowly, "reach into my jacket pocket. You'll find my identification. Please, take a look for yourself." But the officer didn't move. Instead, he barked, "Step back. Don't try anything." The director exhaled quietly, a slow and steady breath. He understood that words alone might not be enough. He had seconds to decide how far to push this without making the officer feel cornered. His training had taught him one unshakable truth: people act most recklessly when they believe they're losing control. For the next few moments, neither man spoke. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint static of the officer's radio and the distant sound of a passing train. The director stood as still as a statue, but his mind worked quickly, considering every option. Finally, the officer shouted again, his voice louder now. "On your knees." The director's eyes narrowed just slightly, but his tone stayed calm. "That won't be necessary. I am not your enemy." The officer didn't lower his weapon. Instead, he repeated the order, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of nerves. The director could see it clearly now: the man was not acting out of duty but out of something else, something deeper and misguided. The director slowly shook his head. "Think carefully," he said in a voice that was calm yet commanding. "Every action has consequences." The words seemed to hang in the air. For a moment, the officer hesitated. His eyes flickered with doubt, but pride held him back from lowering his weapon. The director kept his stance relaxed but his presence strong. He wanted the officer to see not just a man under the glow of streetlights, but a leader who carried himself with dignity, even in the face of threat. His calmness became the loudest message in the scene. A passing breeze rustled the leaves of a nearby tree, scattering a few across the pavement. The sound was soft, but in the tense stillness, it felt loud. The director allowed the moment to stretch, knowing that time itself was on his side. The longer he remained steady, the more the officer's actions would seem unreasonable to any witness who might be watching. And witnesses were watching. From the corner of his eye, the director noticed a phone lifted behind a curtain, recording. A shadowy figure on a porch stood frozen, eyes wide. People were silently gathering evidence of what was happening. The director said nothing more, letting the silence speak for him. The officer, meanwhile, shifted uncomfortably. His arms began to shake slightly under the weight of the weapon he held so tightly. Doubt was starting to creep into his posture, even if his words still carried force. "You don't fool me," the officer muttered, as though trying to convince himself more than anyone else. The director remained silent, standing tall, his eyes calm, his presence unshaken. It was a test of patience, of endurance, of will. And though the weapon pointed at him made the situation dangerous, it was clear that the true power of the moment rested not in the weapon, but in the discipline of the man facing it. 3 minutes had passed since the weapon had been drawn, but they felt far longer. Every tick of the unseen clock stretched into an eternity. The street remained frozen in a strange stillness, two men locked in a silent battle of control. The director's silence became its own strategy. He knew that sometimes, the absence of words could be stronger than any argument. He stood, waiting, steady as stone, while the officer grew more restless, trapped between pride and doubt. It was only a matter of time before the balance shifted. The director stood in complete stillness, his hands raised slightly, his eyes calm. The weapon in front of him glinted under the streetlight, but he did not let his expression change. He had been in tight situations before, but this one felt different. Here he was, in his own country, on a quiet street, facing an officer who should have been his ally. Yet instead of cooperation, he was staring into mistrust and aggression. The officer's breathing was heavy now, each breath uneven. His grip on the weapon was tighter, as if his own nerves were driving him more than logic. The seconds dragged on, and every moment the tension thickened, like invisible ropes wrapping around the scene. The director knew he could not let this carry on forever. He needed to bring the situation toward reason before the officer made a mistake. His voice finally broke the silence, calm but steady. "In my inside pocket," he said slowly, "you will find my identification. Please, check it before you decide anything further." The officer's eyes narrowed. He looked uncertain, torn between suspicion and the weight of authority in the man's voice. The director did not move. His stillness was a silent assurance showing he had nothing to hide, nothing to fear. "Don't reach for anything," the officer snapped, though his voice trembled slightly. "I'll decide what to do." The director gave a slight nod. He had expected resistance. Patience was his shield. He kept his voice even, a tone that carried both calm and command. "Look at the license again. Read the name carefully." The officer glanced at the license in his other hand. He had seen the name before, but his mind had refused to accept it. Now he read it again, slower this time, and doubt flickered in his eyes. The name matched news headlines, briefings, public addresses he had watched on television. Yet instead of lowering his weapon, he shook his head, unwilling to admit he could be wrong. "You think I'm just going to believe that?" the officer said harshly. "Anyone can carry a name." The director tilted his head slightly, his eyes never breaking contact. "That name represents an oath. An oath to protect this nation. The same oath you swore when you put on that badge." His words were calm, but they carried a weight that struck deeper than any sharp command. The officer hesitated. His grip loosened just slightly, though the weapon was still raised. Inside, his pride was fighting with his reason. Lowering the weapon meant admitting he had misjudged. Keeping it raised meant dragging the situation further into dangerous ground. The director waited, his patience unbroken. He knew when to push and when to allow silence to work its power. He allowed the pause to stretch. Each second gave the officer a chance to reflect, to reconsider. From a distance, faint headlights appeared. A black SUV slowed as it approached, then parked several yards away. The street was no longer just a quiet corner of town. The director's security detail, who had been monitoring from a distance, had arrived. Two men stepped out quickly, moving with precision. They were dressed in plain suits, but their posture and movements revealed their training. Their eyes locked immediately on the scene, the director standing calmly, an officer pointing a weapon at him. In seconds, their radios crackled with controlled voices, calling in the situation. The officer noticed the new arrivals. His weapon wavered, his confidence shaken by the sight of figures moving with quiet authority. He shouted suddenly, his voice higher than before. "Stay back! This is my stop!" The agents didn't move closer yet. They knew rushing forward could spark the wrong reaction. Instead, one of them raised his hands in a non-threatening gesture. "Easy there, officer. Let's slow this down. Do you realize who you're pointing that weapon at?" The officer's head turned quickly, his eyes darting between the men and the director. His stance grew uncertain, his weapon shaking slightly in his hand. The world he thought he controlled just moments ago was shifting beneath him. The director finally chose his moment. With steady eyes, he spoke in a firm but measured voice. "Look into my jacket pocket. Inside is my badge. It will confirm everything. Then you will understand the mistake you've made." The officer's face twisted in conflict. Pride, fear, and confusion mixed together. He had demanded power, but now power was slipping away with every passing second. The presence of witnesses, the quiet approach of federal agents, and the calm strength of the man before him created a storm he could no longer control. A neighbor's window opened, and someone called out faintly, "What's going on out there?" A phone camera glowed from across the street, recording. The officer saw it too. The realization hit him hard. This was no longer a private confrontation. Every move he made would live beyond this night. His weapon wavered, lowering just slightly, though his finger still rested against it. "This doesn't prove anything," he muttered, though his voice had lost the sharp edge from before. The director saw the change. He recognized the moment when authority slipped from aggression to doubt. He did not raise his voice, but instead allowed quiet strength to speak. "You've made a mistake," he said simply. "But mistakes can be corrected. It's not too late to put that weapon away." The agents behind the officer moved slowly, keeping distance but ready to act if needed. Their calmness mirrored the director's. They knew the strategy well: give the aggressor room to breathe, while quietly removing any sense of control he thought he still had. The street grew heavier with silence again, but this time the balance had shifted. The officer no longer looked like the man in control. His arms trembled under the weight of his own actions. The director, by contrast, seemed unshaken, his calmness filling the space like unbreakable armor. Finally, with a shaky breath, the officer shifted his stance. The weapon, though still in his hand, lowered slightly. His pride was still fighting, but the inevitability of the situation was pressing on him. The truth of who stood before him, the presence of federal agents, and the eyes of witnesses, everything was stacking against him. The director gave one last quiet statement. "Think carefully, officer. The decision you make right now will follow you for the rest of your life." Those words lingered in the air. They were not a threat, but a reminder. A reminder that choices carry weight, and that responsibility is never something to be taken lightly. The officer stood frozen, his weapon trembling. The moment of truth was closed. The officer's hands shook more noticeably now. He tried to hide it by tightening his grip, but the trembling was clear under the glow of the streetlights. The weapon he had been pointing with confidence minutes earlier no longer looked like a sign of authority but like a heavy burden he struggled to hold. His breathing was uneven, his eyes darting between the director, the agents standing at a distance, and the faint shadows of neighbors who were peeking from their windows. The director remained exactly where he was, his posture calm, his voice steady in its silence. He had no need to raise his tone or move aggressively, his stillness carried a stronger weight than any command. The agents who had arrived stood in practiced formation, not rushing in, but not stepping back either. They were the quiet storm, ready to strike if the officer made a single wrong move. The officer's pride still clung to him. He raised his chin, trying to sound firm. "This is my stop. I give the orders here." His words were sharp, but his voice lacked conviction. He was no longer speaking to the director, he was speaking to himself, trying to convince his own mind that he still had control. The director finally spoke, his words quiet but clear. "You've already lost control. Listen to yourself. Look around you. The people you swore to protect are watching." The officer turned his head slightly, catching the glow of a phone recording from across the street. A teenager whispered to his mother through an open window. Another neighbor raised their blinds higher, unable to look away. The officer felt their eyes on him, and it made the weight of the moment unbearable. He had not expected witnesses. He had not expected accountability to arrive so quickly. The agents began moving with precision, spreading out slowly. Each step they took was measured, no sudden motions that could trigger panic. One of them spoke in a calm, controlled tone. "Officer, lower your weapon. Now. We don't want this to go further than it already has." The officer's jaw tightened. He shook his head quickly, sweat glistening on his forehead. "Stay back," he shouted, though his voice cracked under the strain. His weapon wavered, moving slightly away from the director for the first time, not because he wanted to lower it, but because his arms were losing their steadiness. The director seized that moment to guide the situation further. His voice, calm yet firm, cut through the rising panic. "This can end right here, right now, without damage to you. Put it away." But the officer's pride wouldn't let go. He muttered words under his breath, almost like he was fighting with himself. His knuckles turned white as he gripped tighter. His heart raced so loudly he could hear it in his ears. The agents exchanged a brief glance. They had seen this moment before, the point where reason faded, and stubbornness took over. They knew it was dangerous to wait much longer. In their communication channels, a quiet order was given. The plan was set. The director noticed the subtle shift in the agent's posture. He knew what was coming, though he made no move to interfere. He trusted their timing. His only task now was to remain steady, to hold the officer's attention until the final moment arrived. The seconds stretched like hours. The officer took a step back, his weapon still aimed but his eyes flashing with uncertainty. "You think you can tell me what to do?" he said, his voice breaking. "Not here. Not tonight." The director's reply was simple, almost like a whisper. "Then tonight will define you." And then it happened. One of the agents moved in a blur, stepping forward with practiced speed. Another agent came in from the side, their coordination flawless, their timing precise. The officer barely had time to react. His weapon was struck sharply from his grip, clattering against the pavement with a hollow echo. His arms were forced behind him before he could even think of resisting. In less than 3 seconds, he was on the ground, his face pressed against the cold asphalt, his wrists secured firmly. The neighbors gasped softly from their windows. The teenager recording on his phone nearly dropped it in surprise but kept filming. The officer shouted in frustration, but his voice no longer carried the power it once had. His words scattered into the night, meaningless against the undeniable sight of his restraint. The director exhaled quietly, the first real breath he had allowed himself since the weapon was drawn. He had remained steady the entire time, but even he felt the weight lifting from his chest as the danger finally passed. He stepped slightly closer, looking down at the officer who had once tried to command the scene. "Your weapon is gone," the director said softly. "Your control is gone. But you are still alive. That is more than you deserve from the choice you made tonight." His words were not cruel, but they carried the weight of truth. The agents lifted the officer from the ground. He struggled weakly, but there was no strength left in him. His eyes darted around, looking for someone to support him, someone to believe his version of events. But all he found were witnesses, neighbors with cameras, citizens who had seen everything. His power had dissolved into the night air, replaced with the reality of his actions. One agent retrieved the weapon from the ground, unloading it carefully before placing it in evidence custody. Another agent spoke into his radio, calling in local authorities and federal supervisors to handle the aftermath. The scene, once filled with unbearable tension, was now firmly under control. The director did not shout or celebrate. He simply stood, his hands now lowered, his expression steady. This was not a victory, it was a lesson, one that had cost a man his pride and would soon cost him his career. The officer's voice cracked as he tried to speak. I was just doing my job. The director's eyes were steady, his tone firm but quiet. No. You forgot what your job truly is. The officer lowered his head, unable to respond. The silence around him spoke louder than any excuse he could invent. The neighbors began whispering again. Some filmed, others simply shook their heads. They had just witnessed an officer fall not by violence, but by the weight of his own poor choices. The image of the man on the ground, restrained and powerless, would remain with them long after the night ended. The agents guided the officer toward their vehicle, their movements careful but firm. He no longer resisted. His pride had been broken, his authority stripped away in front of those who once might have respected the uniform he wore. The director took one last look around the street. The air felt lighter now, though the memory of the confrontation would remain heavy in his mind. He glanced toward the neighbor's window, where the teenager with the phone stood frozen, still recording. The director gave a slight nod in that direction, not as a greeting, but as an acknowledgement. The truth had been witnessed, and that mattered. With the officer now secured, the director returned to his car. His steps were unhurried, his mind calm. He had endured the moment with patience, and now it had ended without bloodshed. That was the best possible outcome, even if it left scars of a different kind. The agents closed in around him, ensuring his safety once more. But the director, as always, carried himself with quiet strength, showing that true authority needed no weapon, no shouting, no display of force. It needed only patience, calmness, and an unshakable will. And that was what had won tonight. The street was quiet again, but the silence was no longer tense, it was heavy with reflection. The flashing patrol lights still glowed, casting red and blue shadows on the houses, but the danger had passed. The officer sat in the back of a vehicle now, restrained, his head lowered, no longer in command of anything. The neighbors who had been peeking through curtains stepped back, whispering to each other about what they had seen. Some continued recording, knowing this moment would become part of a much larger story. The director stood near his own car, his face calm but thoughtful. He had not been hurt, yet the weight of what had just happened lingered. He looked down the street, his eyes scanning the quiet town. It was not anger he felt, but a sense of disappointment. He had spent his life working to strengthen trust between citizens and law enforcement, to remind officers that their badge was a symbol of service, not power. And tonight, he had seen that trust broken by one man's poor judgment. The agents gathered around him, speaking in low voices, making sure the situation was fully secure. They asked if he wanted to leave immediately, but he shook his head. He believed in finishing what was started. Leaving too quickly would send the wrong message, as though the night's events were something to hide. No, he wanted the truth to be seen, recorded, and remembered. Minutes later, local police arrived on the scene. Their cars lined the street, and the officers who stepped out were visibly shocked when they realized who was standing there. Their eyes darted to the restrained man in the back of the vehicle, then back to the director. They quickly understood the seriousness of what had taken place. The local police chief, an older man with a stern expression, approached with caution. He saluted the director out of habit, though the situation made it feel heavy and awkward. "Sir," he said, his voice respectful but weighed with embarrassment, "I apologize deeply for what has happened here tonight. This is unacceptable." The director nodded once, his face unreadable. "Your officer made choices that endangered not just me, but the reputation of your department and the trust of your community. You need to handle this properly." The chief nodded quickly, promising an immediate internal investigation. He ordered his men to take custody of the restrained officer and ensure he was processed according to the law. The officer was escorted away, his face pale, his eyes wide with the realization that his career, his badge, and the respect he once had were slipping away. He tried to speak, but his words carried no weight anymore. No one listened. The director remained composed, not raising his voice, not showing anger. His calmness carried a stronger authority than any shouted order could. The agents beside him knew that this was the way true leadership worked, not through force, but through steady presence and quiet dignity. News spread faster than the night itself. Within an hour, reports began to circulate online. Short videos from neighbors appeared on social media, showing the confrontation, the weapon being pointed, and the swift takedown. Headlines soon followed: "Local officer detains FBI director without cause, standoff ends in arrest, misuse of authority sparks federal review." By the time the director returned to Washington, the story was already on national television. Commentators debated, officials issued statements, and the public reacted with shock. For many, it was a painful reminder of the dangers of unchecked behavior in positions of authority. For others, it was a moment of reassurance that even those who misuse power could be held accountable, no matter who they were. The following day, the director appeared at a press conference. He stood at the podium, his suit crisp, his expression calm but serious. Cameras flashed, microphones pointed, and the room fell silent as he began to speak. "Last night," he said in a steady voice, "I experienced something that millions of citizens have experienced in different ways. An encounter with an officer who forgot the meaning of his oath. I want to make one thing clear: this is not about one town, one department, or one man. This is about the responsibility that comes with wearing a badge." He paused, letting the words sink in. His eyes swept across the crowd, making sure the weight of his message reached every ear. Law enforcement is a noble duty. It requires restraint, humility, and honor. When an officer uses fear instead of service, when he uses aggression instead of protection, he does not just fail the individual standing before him, he fails the community, the uniform, and the very foundation of trust. The room was silent, hanging on every word. The director continued, his tone calm but unshakable. "Last night could have ended differently. It could have ended in harm, in tragedy. But it did not, because restraint is stronger than recklessness. Calmness is stronger than pride. And the law, when upheld correctly, is stronger than any misuse of power." Applause broke out softly in the room. It wasn't loud, but it was steady. Reporters scribbled notes quickly, knowing these words would echo across the nation. The director raised his hand slightly, signaling for silence once more. "The officer involved is now under investigation. He will face the consequences of his actions. And let me remind you, no one, regardless of title, position, or uniform, is above the law. That includes me, and that includes every single person who serves under a badge." His closing words carried the weight of finality. "Last night was not about me. It was about what we stand for as a country. And we will always stand for accountability, for justice, and for trust between the people and those who serve them." The press conference ended, but the story did not. Across the nation, people debated the meaning of what had happened. For some, it was shocking to see an FBI director placed in danger by one of the very people meant to protect citizens. For others, it was a powerful reminder that mistakes do not go unseen. The town where it had happened faced heavy scrutiny. Citizens demanded answers. The police chief held his own meetings, promising reforms, training, and a stricter process to ensure accountability. Some officers expressed shame that one of their own had brought such embarrassment to the department. Others quietly admitted it was a lesson long overdue. Meanwhile, the officer who had caused it all sat in silence in a holding cell, awaiting hearings and investigations. His pride had collapsed into regret. The uniform he once wore with confidence was now a memory, and the career he had built was gone. He had believed his actions were a show of power, but they had only revealed weakness. The director, however, returned to his work. He did not let the incident distract him from the responsibilities he carried. He treated it as another lesson, one that he would use to strengthen his mission of building trust between communities and law enforcement. To him, leadership meant turning even the darkest experiences into lessons for others. Weeks later, the headlines faded, but the memory of that night lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it. The neighbors who peeked from their windows still spoke about the calmness of the man who had faced danger without fear. The teenager with the phone still replayed the video, realizing he had recorded a piece of history. And across the nation, officers were reminded, sometimes with training sessions, sometimes with quiet conversations, that their oath was not about control but about service. The director never told the story for glory. He never used it to elevate himself. Instead, he carried it as a reminder. A reminder that authority is fragile if it is not grounded in respect. A reminder that leadership is shown not in moments of ease, but in moments of crisis. And most importantly, a reminder that true power lies not in the weapon pointed at someone, but in the discipline of the one who chooses not to use it.